Welcome to the Digital Media and Imagery video lecture for Art142. So we are going to talk about traditional photography is to film as to digital photography is to image files and how to manage them and work through them. So when you shoot your digital images on a camera, you have to transfer them to your computer to process them and post them. Some new digital cameras have Wi-Fi, which is really cool. It automatically transfers, but a lot of them you either have to remove the memory card and place it into your camera or use a connector port like this. Be sure to understand exactly how to do this. My tip, if you're using Mac, don't use photos for it. I actually use image capture to upload my images from my camera through my MacBook. So we're going to talk a little bit about raster images. Now, a raster or bitmap is an image that's made up of a rectangular set of pixels. And raster is when the density of pixels is great enough, the grid will simulate a continuous image. You ever zoom into a photograph and see lots of little tiny dots? Will come together. If you step back, it creates a full image. And this is kind of how raster images work. Pixels are lined up in an X and Y axis and various tones, gradients to create an image. You may have heard the phrase resolution. It refers to two things: the number of pixels in an image and the density of pixels within an image. So the number of how many pixels and how dense the pixels are based on a grid. So resolution can be referenced by megapixels. So when we mention you need an 8 megapixel camera, it actually talks about how many pixels are within a camera. So the number of pixels in a megapixel is 1 million pixels. You also may describe a graphic on the size of it. So you may hear, I need 120 by 800 image. It refers to it by width and height, which I always forget. Width is the first and height is the second. So it needs an image that, for this example, 180 pixels long and 170 pixels tall. An image may measure 1,000 by 1,000 pixels and has a resolution of 1 megapixel because 1,000 by 1,000 is 1 million. And that's kind of how they determine how many megapixels a camera can have, with how large length times width an image may be. Another way is when they talk about DPI or PPI. Now we are only going to be working in 300 PPI, and PPI is pixels per inch when we're referencing something digital, and DPI is dots per inch, which is when we reference something printed. A lot of times people use the terms interchangeably. I'm going to try my best to try to refer to anything digital as PPI. So if you look at a X and Y axis, every dot is a pixel. So if we're looking at something that's 8 PPI, every inch is going to be 8 pixels. For this example, every 4 pixels would be 1 inch, and so on and so forth. So this is talking about how dense the pixels are. When we're working on web-based graphics, typically the screen wants it to be 72 PPI, but when we're working for things that are tended to be printed, they need to be 300 PPI for the dense pixels to create a large, beautiful image. Now we have an image that's 3 inches by 2¼ inches, and it's at 300 PPI. The quality is fairly good. You can see the images very well. What if it was scaled down to half of that, 150? Now, the length and the width have not changed, but the quality is downgraded. So you can see why we would choose 300. And again, you can see why we would choose 72, and the quality gets lower. Now, different mediums require different resolutions. So anything you see on the internet or a display, a television, is going to be 72 ppi. Anything that we work on that's for fine art or printing requires 300 ppi. You should always work on a project that's 300 because you can scale it down later. Everything you turn in for this class needs to be 300 dpi or ppi. And you can always adjust the resolution within Photoshop, and we will talk about doing that when we're in the Photoshop demo. I'm falling and I can't get up. So when you're working on resolution and trying to scale down, if you need to make something smaller, you can always do that. But you can never make things larger. When you do that, when you scale something larger, Photoshop or whatever graphic program you're using has to invent pixels. When you're making things smaller, it throws pixels out to create a crisper or sharper image. There's going to be several different file formats we'll be using in this class: JPEG, PSD, TIFF, and other ones you might want to be aware of is PNG, GIF, and RAW. So a JPEG is going to be the most common file format we're going to use. It uses lossy compression, which is great when we want to reduce file sizes. It isn't high enough to look good in print. However, sometimes we do print on JPEGs and it will work just fine. It's sort of a default file format. The JPEG is usually what you'll submit to turn in assignments, but you may want to keep all of your images you work on as PSDs. PSD is native to Adobe Photoshop. It means files of this type can be edited non-destructively in Adobe Photoshop. It will save your individual layers and all the work you've made, and you can open and close it as many times without ruining the quality of your image. It's compatible with many Adobe programs. You can plug a PSD in Adobe Premiere, Adobe InDesign, etc. These file sizes tend to be very large, so having a large capable hard drive is good for that. A TIFF is sort of like a sister format to the PSD. It can save layers. It is lossless, so nothing's lost when it's saved or compressed. It's popular for high-end printing, so if you're sending things to be printed to a larger print shop, sometimes they will ask for a TIFF file, but they are extremely large in file size. So that's why you typically don't want to share or save them, but it's sometimes good to save things as a TIFF just in case. A PNG combines the quality of a JPEG and a GIF where it could have transparency. These are really great for the internet. It's a larger file size, but it has a lower load time. This is great for web designers, but not always. If you notice, if you're using a Mac and screenshotting it wants to save it as a PNG file, you typically should not save your photography as PNG files, though. A GIF or a GIF is a file format that supports up to 8 bits per pixel per image, so it has a limited color palette. However, some newer people have been working with the GIF to create sort of full range by stacking the color transparencies. It supports animation and transparency, and often referred to as sort of an early internet theme. A RAW file, which is very important, is uncompressed. It's more like a latent film image and has to be processed before we can see the image. You should always shoot RAW when you're shooting your camera, if it's capable of doing so. So most photographs have 8-bit of information. A RAW file can have 16 bits, so you can have full range and you can get that detail that you would not be able to get when shooting with just JPEG. There'll be different types of file formats. So some may be a CR2 if you're using Canon, NEF for Nikon, or there's also the DNG, which is the digital negative, which is a raw file from Adobe. Another thing to note is storage. So think about the storage in your camera. So I shoot 32 gigabyte SD card on my camera. So if I have a 32 gigabyte flash drive, I'm going to use that very quickly. So getting an external hard drive might be good, or multiple flash drives. And also good to think about, I never delete any of my photographs until the very, very end. I may always pull up a shot from a shoot that I didn't know I liked and gave some time to look at. Another thing is to keep organized. So you may want to do a backup of all your images on Google Drive or even a Dropbox. Just so you know, if your files or your hard drive gets lost, you have a backup and you're prepared for class or for your clients. Another thing is organization. Keep your files organized when you're using a flash drive, hard drive, or even in Google Drive. I do a lot of nested folder formats to keep organized. This way I know exactly where everything is or where it should be. This is a practice that you should start implementing when working with your computers. Another thing to cover is file naming conventions. So I'm fairly strict on file naming conventions. This is so if you're working with a large group, they know exactly what file they're working with. And sometimes if something is mislabeled, if you're using if you're running a script to find files, it may not be able to find the images. So it's always going to be the name of your file. There should be no spaces, no periods, no weird symbols, and the file name should be fairly simple. So an example could be your name underscore name of photograph or name of series underscore 01, a period, and an extension. You never need to delete or rechange the extension. If you need to exchange the extension, whether from a JPEG to a PSD, you need to do that in an appropriate program. There's some readings you need to go over to prepare for the quiz that you will be taking for the Digital Media and Imagery lecture. Feel free to watch this as many times and take some notes.